That's it.
Right, and now somebody's got to be king. Who could that be?
We know the answer, huh?
Well, we still have 2 minutes, so in case anybody is coming on Zoom, we are on YouTube now for anyone who, yeah, but for anyone who's coming on Zoom, we still got 2 minutes before we begin.
Thank you for your expanded view, informing us in a real way.
Oh, absolutely. Well, again, that's just a taste. On the 13th, I'm going to do a full debrief of my trip, which will include not just things like Majd Shams, but the whole rest. I mean, I was there for over a week.
With the photo.
Yeah, with the photos, and videos where appropriate. I've got a couple, not many, but I've got a couple. Yeah, it was a really interesting trip, and of course, I've been a couple times since October 7th, so it's some of it wasn't totally new to me, but there's a lot of things that are very, very interesting going on in Israel under the, not just with the things you read in the news. Hopefully we emerge from this to something better. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I don't know what this administration's plan for going forward is, but we'll see. I hope it works
Take
out.
all the Palestinians out of Gaza?
I don't think so. Let's put it this way. Whether or not that would be a good solution, whether or not, I don't even have to weigh in on it because it's not going to happen. Arab foreign ministers had a big summit today where they once again reiterated it's not going to happen. There's another thing behind it, but we can go into that at another time. I'm glad now it's 9, so we'll get started with our Torah study. Of course, we'll start with our blessing for the study of Torah that starts the usual way and ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. If you say Amen at the end, you get full credit. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. You say Amen, you get full credit. Okay, so we are in chapter 2, and so the Philistines at this point have great control. Remember, they beat Saul. So it's kind of not a very organized, totally controlled, Judah, Israel, any of it. Like the tribal territories, none of it's totally well controlled at this moment. And so that's where David has to step into the gap now that he's done his poem, which was chapter 1, where we get our Ech naflu giborim, right? We love that phrase in English, right? How the mighty have fallen. And of course, he says that about Jonathan, who he says of him, your love was wonderful to me. Ahavatcha li me'ahavat nashim. Your love was wonderful to me. Nifle'ata, more than love of women. And he had a couple wives, so that's saying something. Okay, so sometime afterwards, David inquired of God, shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah? And God said, yeah, do that. David further asked, which one shall I go up to? And God replied, Hebron. What do we know about Hebron? Okay, the tomb of the patriarchs is there. What else do we know about Hebron?
Tremendous conflicts yet today.
Damn, you got both of mine. Thank you. Yes, Hebron today is in what is Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, depending on what term you prefer. It is controlled. It is one of the only really split city in the West Bank. All the other cities are are just Palestinians. No Jews live there. All the other cities are totally under what's called Area A, which is Palestinian civil and security control, except for Hebron, which is half lived in by Jews and is one of the most important cities in Judaism. After Jerusalem, it's one of the top ones. Again, the Tomb of the Patriarchs is there, and it comes up over and over again because it was a major hub in the time of the Davidic kingdom. Okay, so God says, go to Hebron first. It's a good place to go first. So remember, David hasn't conquered Jerusalem yet. So he's not saying go to Jerusalem because that's not the place yet. So David went up there along with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, wife of Nabal the Carmelite. So again, they're going to identify her as that forever, it seems, right? We remember the story from 1 Samuel where David was so smart and it worked out, and they were both really smart, and so they agreed to work together, Abigail and David. And so it's just interesting to me that she's still Eshet Naval HaKarmeli. So he went up with his wives, and David also took the men who were with him, each with his family. So about 600 guys and their families, and they settled in the towns about Hebron. So, because of course, where was David living before this? Yes, he was living in Philistia, essentially. He was living in one of the towns there. And that no longer, with the Philistines occupying parts of Israel, they didn't want... it's not good to be seen living in that area. Better to be living again in one of the heartland, right? Because again, back in the time of the Bible, much more Jews lived in what's now Judea and Samaria or the West Bank than in the coastal plain. Nowadays, most of the Jews live in the coastal plain and not the hills. What?
Did you say not the Flint Hills?
Oh, no. I said not the hills, but I mean, there aren't that many Jews in the Flint Hills either, but I was specifically talking about just the hills of like, they're not really mountains out there, but in the West Bank, but they're big hills. Anyway, okay, so they did that and they settled in the towns around Hebron, and the people of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah, right? And David was told about the agents of Yavesh Gilead who buried Saul. So they appointed him king over Judah. They didn't have the permission to make him the king, right? The high king, the king of all Israel. That's not in their power. But David was of their tribe. So they're like, okay, so we can make you our king, right? If we're all, especially think about it, if parts of tribes are occupied by the other, they're like, okay, well, we can make you our. It's a restoration. Some people think of Saul to David as if it's so as if it's just like okay, we took the crown off of Saul's head and put it on David's head. But in a way, David has to reconquer the territory that Saul conquered the first time, which is good because it gives more legitimacy. But there's a difficulty there, and I want to make sure that we see that. Yeah. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. We'll move on then. So in 5, so David sent messengers to the people of Yavesh Gilead, and said to them, may you be blessed of God because you performed this act of faithfulness to your Lord Saul and buried him. May God in turn show you true faithfulness, and I too will reward you generously because you performed this act. Now take courage and be brave, for your Lord Saul is dead, and the house of Judah have already anointed me king over them. What's happening here? Why is this? David was just made king of the Judahites. Why is this his first action?
Strengthens their patriotism while also kind of swiftly enabling him to gain the reins of that patriotism.
Of whose patriotism?
The people that were faithful to Saul now can be faithful to.
Good. Yes, absolutely. It's an entirely political move. He's trying to, David understands that if he's going to be the king, and he knows from Samuel that he's going to be the king, he has to start gathering support, not just in Judah, where it's his people and they already protected him before, and now he lives again with them and they made him king. Like, if he wants to get the whole land, if he wants to expand, if he wants to reunite all the tribes together under his kingship, he's got to start with some of the most loyal to Saul. And so he starts, he does what a king would do. He says, you all are really great. He sends an entreaty, right? This is like sending an ambassador with a letter under his seal. And he says to the people of Yavesh Gilead, he says, look, you all were really loyal to Saul, and that's great. I was also loyal to Saul. I mean, he wanted to kill me a lot, but I maintain I was loyal to Saul, and I never killed him or harmed him. It wasn't me who killed him. And I will reward you. Under what pretense can I reward you? Well, I am now king of the Judahites. Right? We're planting seeds. David is great at political seed planting. We saw in the last book, he's great at it in this book too. Any thoughts? Any thoughts or questions at this point? Every time I get to a end of a little sugya, I like to.
It's interesting, like the move to quell dissent pretty early. Like it's almost an attempt to like mitigate unrest, possibly because he knows that they were just kind of on opposite sides, and so like he's almost reaching over the aisle immediately and trying to establish a common ground.
Absolutely. Thank you for, I appreciate that comment. There's a unity aspect of it too, where we're being partially occupied. The Philistines have expanded a lot. We need to work together, even if we were once rivals, to fight back.
It also makes me think retrospectively of the battle with him and Goliath, like if that was more political than like a stroke of genius kind of thing, where he takes advantage of the circumstances to specifically embed himself in a position to be able to gain more power.
It's a really interesting thing about David that our Torah has a position on him. It doesn't appear as much here in Samuel, but Chronicles will make it clear that our Torah has a position. And it's that the Torah believes that David is not cynical. But David's enemies, and with plenty of evidence, as you can see in the Torah, believe he is cynical, that none of it is based on faith. All of it is based on political maneuvering.
Opportunism.
Right. The truth might be in the middle. I don't know. But the Torah believes that David did this based on faith and service to the people, not based on opportunism. But I must say, from reading Samuel, certainly there's room for argument about his motivations, because it certainly serves him. And as our prophet Mel Brooks once said, it's good to be the king. So it's not shocking that he might seek such a position, like without the blessing or ordination of God. But the Torah has a very clear position, which is that this is God's will and it's not David's cynicism. That David is truly a believer. That's why God declares that the Mashiach will come from the seed of David, because David is this truly not observant in the way we think of it today. Like he didn't have payas and wrap tefillin every morning, probably, but observant in the sense of he's like attuned, always thinking about what God would want of him. Maybe he is. I hope so. It's nice to give him the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, so but Avner, son of Ner, which is funny because like Avner probably should be the father of Ner, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, Avner, father of Ner, is the son of Ner. Confusing. Maybe they just do every generation is Ner, Avner, Ner, Avner, and they're just like, so one of them will be bound to be the son of Avner. Anyway, I mean, this is actually how naming kind of works in the Tanakh. Like I say that in jest, but like that actually might be what's happening here. There is a chance that's what's happening. Anyway, so Avner, son of Ner, who was Saul's army commander, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Ishbosheth isn't his name, son of Saul, and brought him across to Mahanaim. So what does Ishbosheth mean? Who knows what Busha means? No one here has been to Israel. Well, if you've been to Israel, if you walk around on Shabbat, if you drive on Shabbat, maybe they'll scream Busha at you. Yeah, Busha means shame. So Ishbosheth, man of shame. So why is he a man of shame? Probably because he surrendered. He didn't die. He was supposed to be dead. He didn't die. He probably maybe he did something cowardly. And that might be why we're calling him that. So Ishbosheth ben Shaul. It also, by the way, it also helps we don't get a name. So we don't know it. The Torah gives itself an out. We're doing a meta commentary here, but the Torah gives itself an out of declaring which son of Saul at this point is it. And so brought him across to Mahanaim. It means across because I think it's on the other side of the Jordan. Mahanaim is on the other side of the Jordan, I think. And made him king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin, over all Israel. So essentially they're saying in the end, Saul's army commanders took Saul's remaining kid and set him up as the king, right? Because the government doesn't just like you try and keep it going. So like he's like, I have this guy. And we're going to go to the Jews who live on the other side, the east bank of the Jordan River, and we're going to set up here because it's more defensible. And then eventually we'll move back across to the west bank and to Israel proper, right? To the rest of Israel. So Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king of Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah supported David. So Judah never, it said all Israel, right? Yisrael Kula, but it wasn't really Kula. It wasn't really all Israel. Because the biggest tribe, Judah, said, no, we got a king. We don't want this Ishbosheth. Why are we still calling him Ishbosheth? Well, again, he doesn't matter. He's not a guy. He's not relevant to us. He's not a real king, right? It's a way to take away. He's not a real king.
It's a military dictatorship.
Right, it's a setup. It's a government in exile almost of Saul's reign. But those of us who are reading the Torah know Saul's reign has been over for some time. And so again, this is right. So Judah, which can function basically on its own because it's so big. If you look at the maps, do I have to? This is later, but just to point out, the Judah part is still real, is still basically their tribal territory. This is later, and you get all the other tribes are in the kingdom of Israel, and Judah's in its own thing. So just remember, Judah is big and powerful on its own. The kingdom of Judah will last 200 years longer than that northern kingdom of Israel. So when Judah says we've got our king, they're not playing around. They mean it. They're also able to mean that. They're able to do it on their own. If the tribe of Dan said we're setting up a king, everyone else would say, okay, you and your like 10 acres, cool. Like nobody cares. You don't have enough men. You don't have an army. Judah can field its own army, and that's an important thing to know. Yeah, please interrupt me.
Name.
Right. Yeah, we don't know who Ishbosheth is.
Right.
We hope it's not Jonathan. No, he's dead. We know he's dead.
Know about any Saul's everything?
I shouldn't have taken a bite right before you finished your question. Yeah, I think we know they're dead, or they were supposed to be dead.
Didn't he have a son that was like lame or maimed or something, and then he actually ran away? Or
Oh,
is that
maybe.
a story?
No, it could be. Yeah, I'm not sure. My recollection was that the two of his other sons were killed next to Jonathan in that battle where they all fell.
But I'm thinking in the story, we never hear of him. We hear of Jonathan clearly. But I was surprised to learn, in fact, that he had other sons.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Now I just threw everything off because I was going to go back to Samuel 1, but we don't need to do that. Actually, we're just going to
Mephibosheth,
Ishbosheth.
yeah, or well, that's
What does it say?
is his.
Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, who was the son of Saul.
Okay, so that was.
Could be, but again, that would next technically be a son of Saul. That I mean, it would be technically in the sense that it's a grandson of Saul, but in any event, yeah, I'm not sure. But the point is, we have this guy now. Whether or not he's the son of Saul, also, it's not extremely important. His purpose is to exist in the way he does, which would be sad as a real person if he was a real person. That his existence was just to be a placeholder until David was king. But what can you do? Sometimes our job is, we all have a fate, and who knows what it is. That's for God to know, I guess. So, okay. Oops, I'm not nearly where I was supposed to be. Which verse are we on?
11 or 12.
11. Okay. So, the length of time that David reigned in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So this is a while, right? Once Abner, son of Ner, and the soldiers of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, marched out from Mahanaim to Givon, and Joab, son of Zeruiah, and the soldiers of David also came out. They confronted one another at the pool of Givon. One group sat on one side of the pool and the other group on the other side of the pool. Avner said to Joab, "Let the young men come forward and sport before us." Right? And yeah, let them, Joab said, right? So they're like, okay, we're all just sitting here. It's an interesting situation. David says he's king over this tribe. This guy says he's king over all the other tribes. Neither of them are there, just their generals. And they say, why don't we have the guys play around? They'll fight a little for our amusement, right? That's how you pass the time then. We fight a little bit. And they said, yeah, sport, right? It's like jousting and stuff, right? Like we're familiar with this concept from European history. The idea of like tourneys, and if you watch Game of Thrones, right, sparring, like, right, it's like, yeah, let's have a little competition. Like it's not meant to be necessarily like let's fight each other. We're all Jews, right? We're all on the same team, kind of. It's an interesting situation. They came forward and were counted off, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 of David's soldiers. Now, if you're a guy, before we get to the fight, if you're a guy and you've got a king, and this other guy, I'm a guy and I got a king, and AJ's another guy and he's got a different king. When we fight, what's usually happening? We're trying to kill each other, right? Because we're fighting for our kings. Does it seem like a good idea to start a sparring match between two rival factions? I don't know. It doesn't seem like a great idea to me. It seems like it's destined to end in a real fight. Let's see what happens.
Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Yes. But nobody has swords in football. See, the important thing is nobody has swords and they can't decide if they get upset. They can push each other, but they can't slice each other's heads off. Which is an important thing to make sure is still true about football. But
When they start firing-
hockey, you could do more because they give them weapons. But again, in football, there are no weapons. So it's, again, once you get weapons involved, you can really start hurting people.
But it's still fun.
Sure, it's tribal, but like, right. But that's the thing. We put nice guardrails there. And also, like, you know, it's like one of those things. What if our football team was playing Iran's football team? Or, you know, it's like, huh. It's a little realer when it's, you know, it's like, I remember back in the early 2000s when Cuba would play the US in baseball. And it was like, it feels a little strange for this fun sports thing to be happening while we're like technically warring and all that. Like, it's like, you know, it's like, it seems like a weird thing to do in the midst of life and death struggle. Anyway, yeah.
Exact details of, but didn't that just happen in France? That Israel was playing, I want to say an Iranian team, I'm not sure.
Not Iranian. Iran refuses to play in the Olympics. If an Iranian comes up against an Israeli, they forfeit. Iran will never play Israel until they're overthrown and replaced with another
But
government.
there was civilian murders after, around and after.
Oh, in Amsterdam, yes, Israel played a sporting match, and afterwards, locals, we'll call them, locals, chased and tried to beat Jews in the streets. Yeah.
That's proving your point, that it's happening here today.
It inflames tensions, at least. We can agree that, I mean, I don't know. I think that was a legitimate sporting thing, and people shouldn't chase people in the streets. I think that's a,
The sports thing was like an excuse.
yeah, lots of things were going on there. There was a little bit of agitation. There was a lot of preparation. Like, there was also preparation on the side of the people who were going to do the chasing. So like there was a lot happening, and it's what happens. Hopefully now Israeli sporting events can move back to Israel and won't have to be hosted in Europe, so that they can avoid that kind of thing. Okay. So yeah, so what happened in this fight? So in verse 16, each one grasped his opponent's head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side. Thus they fell together. That place, which is in Giv'on, was called Helkat Chazurim. Yeah, so
So there's no decisive winner.
and that Helkat Hazurim means field of the flints. So, you know, they used sharpened flints as blades often. If they didn't, you know, it's hard to make iron even in the Iron Age. So you didn't always use, sometimes you use stone.
Bronze Age, Philistines were in the Iron Age.
Well, the David point is seen as the 1000 BC, the idea of how that it's part of the late Bronze Age collapse moving into the early Iron Age. So whether or not they have the iron yet, I don't know, but they're gonna get iron, so it'll work out. But yeah, Field of the Flints. The fight, a fierce battle ensued that day. Oh, who could have seen that coming? And Avner and the men of Israel were routed by David's soldiers. It's worth noting, Steinsaltz notes that, the commentaries note that David's soldiers were probably much better fighters. Whether or not they outnumbered them, though they might have, David's soldiers had fought, they'd been mercenaries for like 20 years now. David had basically been a mercenary company commander for 20 years almost before he was king. He did it for the Philistines. He did it for, you know, he did it for everybody. So the idea is that they were probably stronger than Saul's soldiers, or, you know, Saul's sons or grandsons' forces. Okay. And the three sons of Tzeruiah were there: Yoav, Avishai, and Asahel. Asahel was swift of foot, like a gazelle in the open field. Right? We like those gazelles. They're fast. And Asahel ran after Avner, swerving neither right nor left in his pursuit of Avner. There's just a thing there. The Torah really likes when you don't swerve. The Torah really likes straight, like going straight in one direction. Even with justice, that's the same metaphor they use. You will veer not to the right or to the left in justice, but will be a straight line. That's so that it's just interesting to see that same thing come up again. Avner looked back and shouted, "Is that you, Asael?" "Yes, it is," he called back, which is a weird thing to be happening while chasing somebody to kill them. "Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me." He's like, so he's gonna. Avner said to him, "Turn to the right or to the left and seize one of our boys and strip off his tunic." But Asahel would not leave off. Now, what is Avner saying to him?
Don't kill me. Kill someone else and pretend.
Right. It would be easier for you to just take the armor off of one of these other kids that we just drafted and say you won. That doesn't seem to be what he's going to do, right? But Asahel would not back off. So boop boop boop. 1 sec, I gotta get. Oh, that's the wrong thing. That's a translation. So Avner again begged Asahel, "Stop pursuing me, or I'll have to strike you down. How will I look your brother Yoav in the face?" Right? They're not friends, by the way. Avner and Yoav are not friends. They're just rivals, kind of. They're both the heads of the army. So, but yeah, that's not a really great threat. It's great Jewish guilt, but it's not a great threat. Because he's like, I don't really care, and also I'm going to kill you. Like he's like, I don't think this is going to end the way you think it's going to end. So when he refused to desist, Avner struck him in the belly with a backward thrust of his spear. So he's catching up to him, right? Puts a spear. You could take a short spear and hold it in your arm, and then just let it drop a little and boosh, and thrust it back at the guy. So he's catching up to him. He's maybe going to hit him. He thrusts back, and the spear protruded from his back. That's not today. That's a pretty hard thing to survive. In the Iron Age, no. There was no surgery. I mean, there was no way you could stop the blade. I mean, it's just you run somebody through with a spear. That's pretty much the end of it. And sure enough, he fell there and died on the spot. And all who came to the place where Asahel fell and died halted. But Yoav and Avishai continued to pursue Avner. And the sun was setting as they reached the hill of Ammah, which faces Gia on the road to the wilderness of Givon. The Benjaminites rallied behind Avner, forming a single company. There aren't that many Benjaminites. Remember, there are really few Benjaminites. Remember what happened at the end, right before Saul was king? Right, the men of Benjamin were basically removed by death from Israel. So like they don't have a lot of people. They've got enough for like a single company. And they took up a position on the top of the hill. Avner then called out to Yoav, "Must the sword devour forever? You know how bitterly it's going to end. How long will you delay ordering your troops to stop the pursuit of their own kindred?" An interesting perspective. He doesn't see any reason for David's troops to fight Israelites, especially when they're being occupied by the Philistines. David does. It's also interesting. We never heard of an opportunity for these people to submit to David. For years, David's been ruling in Judah. This guy's been ruling. I want to know what's going on in those conversations, but like, they must be trading at least a little, probably. Like, I'm surprised David never made a play for the land. Maybe he never said he couldn't kill these people. So maybe he just thought that was the easier way. 27. And Yoav replied, "As God lives, Chai Elohim, If you hadn't spoken up, the troops would have given up the pursuit of their kindred only the next morning. That's really funny. We would have separated in peace, even if not as friends. Yoav then sounded the horn and all the troops halted. They ceased their pursuit of Israel and stopped the fighting. Avner and his men marched through the Arava all that night. After crossing the Jordan, they marched through all of Bitron, until they came to Machanaim. After Yoav gave up the pursuit of Avner, he assembled all the troops and found 19 of David's soldiers missing besides Asahel. David's soldiers, on the other hand, defeated the Benjaminites and the men under Avner and killed 360 of them. They bore Asahel away and buried him in his father's tomb in Beit Lechem. Then Yoav and his men marched all night. Day broke upon them in Hebron.
I'm puzzling, Rabbi. You pointed out in the map that you showed us.
Yeah.
Before, the 10 tribes of northern Israel. Well, the 2 tribes that were in the south were Judah and Benjamin. In a way. it seems
In the
that-
kingdom, yeah. In the kingdom period, that's a couple hundred years from now. Anything can happen in that amount of time. Yes. In the kingdom period, the kingdom of Judah is 2 tribes, not 1. It's Judah and Benjamin. But again, Benjamin is so small and silly at this point, it's basically not it's basically not a functioning entity. Yes. Any other thoughts or questions? We're at the end of chapter 2. So we're going to have a war now. We need to have a war. We need to have a war so that David can conquer the land. Lots of stuff. David's going to conquer a lot of stuff in this book. Yeah.
There's almost no commentary by a prophet putting this in God's hands. It's just left there.
We already have that. He has Samuel's promise that he would be king of Israel.
They usually get reminders and things.
We're going to start seeing less and less of, well, to be fair, in Kings, we'll see more of prophets because we cover a lot more time. And so we'll cover the prophets of those kings. Especially Elijah is in the book of Kings. So Elisha, we'll get those characters, more in those books. But yeah, we're not hearing a lot from prophets at this point, right? We need Nathan is the thing. We're not yet at Natan. We're not yet at the next prophet is the thing. Right now we don't really have one, right? I mean, Samuel's dead. Even though Saul tried to bring him back for a moment, Samuel's dead. And we don't have anyone who got a call yet. So we're in a period between, but we got what we needed, which is David got the promise from Saul that he would be king. He's operating under that assumption. Why these prophets never publicized this? Strange, because you'd think that would take away all of Saul's legitimacy, but they don't do that. That's not how it works. These things don't get told to everybody, just a couple people. That is kind of a Jewish tradition in a way. So it's not totally unheard of. After all, the oral Torah at this point is still being passed along orally. Nobody knows it even exists. If you believe it started at Sinai. So, it's an interesting situation.
The things I kind of walk away with that is it's
Mhm.
interesting how they don't necessarily put a blame on any given side for starting the conflict. It was kind of like
Yeah.
this agreed thing and it kind of just
Right. They agreed to a competition and then it escalated into a war when they all killed each other.
David's side is again the one that decides to kind of walk away, but then 19 people take on 300 people. And I think that's pretty.
Well, 19 people died. There were more than 19 and
Oh,
300.
okay.
But 19 of David's died and 350 of Saul's died. So We're just gonna call them Sauls at this point, by the way. We're just gonna say they're Sauls. It's the house of Saul versus the house of David at this point. And we'll see who's gonna win. Yeah.
Raised another problem.
Uh-oh.
I hadn't
What,
thought
yeah.
of on my own.
What's up?
If God wants David to be king, why doesn't he say, I don't want my people fighting and slaughtering each other. Let me proclaim to all of you that David is to be king.
He's a sports fan.
Could be. It's interesting. That is a good point. There's why don't they do that? It could be that there's no point. If you believe, after all, the prophet didn't make a big public declaration that Saul lost the kingship and David was going to get it. If you believe God ordained Saul to be the king, and therefore Saul's line to be king, there may not be a lot of point in trying to argue the theological point. Sorry to use the word twice in the same sentence. That David should be king. And it's like, well, you're going to say, well, the prophet said this. It's like, well, the prophet in front of everyone anointed Saul king. The same yours. Well, it was Samuel. Well, ours, it was Samuel also. Like, it's like, that might not be a convincing argument. That's what I'm going to go with, is that I think it wouldn't be a convincing argument to people who believe that Saul's lineage is supposed to be king. Meanwhile, the Judahites are fine. They just want to do their own thing. Again, they're big enough to kind of be their own force, so they may not have the same compulsion. To be fair, they protected David from Saul for years when he lived in the hill country. The tribal boundaries didn't disappear when there was a kingship established. The tribal rivalries none of that disappeared. Over time, it would disappear. And David would have something to do with that by making the country a unified, larger place. But yeah, it's complicated. Okay, chapter 3.
Is the purpose of this chapter merely historical, or are there moral or spiritual lessons to be gained from that chapter?
Of chapter 2? So the interesting thing about Joshua through Kings is that they're called the history books.
I see.
Not because you don't learn moral or whatever things from them, but because they have to tell the story of getting from entering the land of Israel to the historical record that we have and know about. We know about the kings of Israel and Judah. We know they were real people. So we have to get ourselves there, and this is part of how we do that. But you are learning about this chapter. I mean, again, not so much, there's not a ton, but the story of David is teaching us a lot of things about faith and resilience, and the story of David, I think, is actually very inspiring. He has a very difficult life, upbringing, and development period, and he's also, the king tries to kill him a bunch of times, and he ends up, through faith, essentially through doing what God tells him to, becoming the greatest king of our people, which is a good lesson for all of us, I think. Chapter 3. So, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long drawn out, but David kept growing stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker. Shockingly, a guy named Ishbosheth, a man of shame, was not exactly the world's greatest leader, and it's not going great for him and his forces. They're losing this war. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second was Chilav by Abigail, wife of Nabal the Carmelite. The third was Avshalom. He's not going to be the father of peace. Avshalom, son of Maacah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. So we assume that this kingdom had friendly relations with David, but he might have conquered them and been given uh, and given her to him. But that's important to mention that woman, and because that's going to come up. That's a hint that will come in handy later. That's a helpful piece of foreshadowing. The fourth was Adoniah, son of Hagit. The fifth was Shaphatya, son of Avital. And the sixth was Itram, by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David and Hebron. So, what's one thing you notice from this list of David's children? Yeah, he's got way more than two wives now. Well, I mean, the polygamy was already happening, but polygamy isn't banned in Judaism, by the way, until for Ashkenazim, Rabbeinu Gershom about 1,000 years ago. And for Sephardim, 1949, when they were moved to Israel and they were forced to give up their many wives. Because in many Muslim countries, you can still have by the way, it's not polygamy, it's polygyny. Because one woman can't have 5 husbands. It's just plural marriage where one man can have multiple wives. So it's polygyny, not polygamy. But still, we practiced polygyny up until about 1,000 years ago. It's considered now that every Jew, even though Rabbeinu Gershom was a Ashkenazi rabbi, that every Jew is bound by his 3 takanot, and that his 3 takanot that were actually supposed to expire about a decade ago are actually perpetual and forever in effect because of their importance. Those 3 takanot, anyone remember what they are? Well, you know what one of them is, the end of polygyny. The other 2? Okay. One of them is don't open other people's mail, which is a fun one. And the other one is both a husband and wife have to consent to a divorce. All 3 of those rules are still in perpetual recognition in the Jewish community, even though they were technically supposed to expire after 1,000 years, which was 10 years ago. Because again, he did it in like 1013. So in 2013, it was supposed to expire, but we decided we're not super eager to go back to, I don't know, reading other people's mail, or not that that was ever supposed to be allowed, but it's like, that just made it true, or allowing men to divorce their wives without consent, or the other one.
When you say we, which group of Jews are you referring to?
It's a good question. It's supposed to be binding on basically all Jews you would hear about today, because we all follow the rabbinic tradition. Reform Judaism, which we're a part of, obviously look, we allow different interpretations, but I have yet to meet a Reform Jew who's managed to say that their interpretation is polygamy is okay, and go by that. To be fair, there are some who try, and that's not something that's caught on in our movement.
I meant a divorce where only one party wants to initiate it.
Oh, they still some people still try that, but they're usually if a man gives a get, usually it's very rare where a woman won't accept it, because she has more freedom, and once she's free, once she's free of him, if it's a problem for her, she can marry again or do other things. She can do whatever she likes. But there are situations with agunot, or chained women, where in Haredi communities, ultra-Orthodox communities, men will refuse to give a get when a woman wants one. And so the woman essentially wants a divorce, but the man refuses to give it to her. That is punished. That is punished in the Jewish community, but it is possible. The problem being that rabbis get to make their own decisions often. And so if you go to one rabbi who allows something, then the wife has to go to the rabbinical court of a certain country to get that rabbi's opinion overturned and force the husband to give a get.
I was thinking that doesn't occur in Reform Judaism.
No, it doesn't. In Reform Judaism, first of all, if someone gets divorced, sometimes they ask for a get. Sometimes they just get divorced civilly and they don't ask for a get. But in Reform Judaism, we believe that if one party seeks a get, that the marriage is dissolved. Yes, it could be the woman. Yes. So yeah, we have an egalitarian system where either party can initiate divorce and the other party doesn't have a choice. We just record that they sought it and we deliver the get and that's it. There's nobody else has to sign it.
So earlier you said there are three things that are still or
Binding.
but it sounds to me like only two of them are in Reform Judaism.
Well, binding is an interesting word in Reform Judaism. As much as anything is binding on us, those things are binding on us. Especially, look, we take Rabbeinu Gershom to a whole nother level on the divorce thing. It's not that it's not binding on us, but we see it even more stringently or egalitarianly. I don't know how you want to put that. That's not a word. To Rabbeinu Gershom. On the other two, we don't open other people's mail anyway because it's against the law in the United States, and dina de malchut dina, the law of the land is the law. So that's not really relevant to us in the United States because it's not allowed to look through people's mail. If you were a Soviet Jew working for the Soviet Postal Service, that's where you'd have trouble, right? Back in the day, because like they'd be like, yeah, open people's mail, and we'd be like, not so much on the opening mail. Yeah, and of course the polygamy thing, we don't really do that. But no, again, just no Jews really do that anymore. Anyway, that's my lesson on Rabbeinu Gershom for the morning. We should all remember Rabbeinu Gershom. He was a pretty cool dude for someone who lived 1,000 years ago.
This is one of the first times you've seen multiple relationships being listed in the Torah versus just being like there was Sarah and then you had like some other people. Right.
First of all, we get their names for the most part, but we do Jacob.
Right. That was like
4, Bilhah and Zilpah. Well, I mean, it's good to be the patriarch. What do you want me to say? I mean, you know, I can't account for every of Jacob's whereabouts. He was a bit of a trickster, but yeah, I mean, and also David and Solomon, they're kings. They're going to have, what do we call them?
Concubine.
Sure, yeah. There's a Hebrew word for it that's a little less, that translates more to like maidservants, but yes, concubines, essentially. Yeah, they're kings. They're kings 3,000 years ago. It's not foreign to the region. It's native to the region. So it's just kind of how it goes. But they're not wives. Those people aren't wives. It's important to make a distinction.
So were any of David's wives acquired through war?
Well, we're not well, some could be. We think we're not sure about Makkah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. We're not sure. It could have been either. It could have been that he beat the king and therefore he got his daughter as whatever, spoils, I don't know. Or it could be that they had such a good relationship that to make an alliance, they did that. So we're not sure yet who of his wives came if they came via spoil.
In the first case, though, then there would be a distinction between wife and concubine.
Yes. Yes, yeah. There is generally a distinction between wife and concubine. Although if the king wants a son of a concubine to be a player, a king can make that determination. It just matters. Like it matters more, if your dad's the king, then you can be a big player. That's just how it goes.
If you had like a promising son, you'd be like, oh, she's my wife, not just
you could do that. Yeah, you could do that. Look, that's still way more biologically based than how the Romans did inheritance and transfer of legacy and lineage. They just were like, hey, that kid's smart. He's my kid now. I adopt him. And it's like, hey, I mean, you might get a better generations that way if you do it that way, if you do it by merit and not blood. But no, ours still basically go based on blood, but the relationships can change based on need, especially if you're the king. I'll stop quoting that thing from Mel Brooks. I know that when he does it, it's a little lechery when he does it in the movie, but I think of it more as like a thing. But yeah, it was a while ago. Anyway, okay, so verse 6. We know now that David has a bunch of wives. There'll be more wives. There'll be more wives. There are always more wives for these guys. For David, his son, they're big wife guys. Not like we mean that today, but like, yeah. Anyway, during the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Avner supported the house of Saul. We know this because we saw in the last chapter the fight. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Avner, "Why have you lain with my father's concubine?" Why is that a problem, by the way? She's not married. She's not attached to anybody. Why would that be a problem for Ishbosheth?
You wouldn't know who the kid is.
Oh, you mean if the guy got with his dad's concubine and had a kid? Okay, I mean, it's been a couple years. It couldn't be Saul's kid. So what might be another? It could be. What's another possibility?
Political power.
Yes, it could be a move to, you could have aspirations for the throne. You marry a former concubine of the king, you could be trying to put yourself in, you might be giving yourself a little bit too much importance, right?
Seems like insecurity on the other aspect.
Yeah, well, he's a bad leader. So yeah, he probably should have chilled out since the guy was the head of the army and he needs this guy. But I agree with you from a political perspective. Ishbosheth is a dummy. But that's kind of his purpose in the story, is to be a dummy. So that's not like shocking. But yeah, so okay. Avner Avner doesn't respond well to this kid that, remember, Avner set him up as king, took him away to Machanaim so that he could become king. And now this is what he has to say to him. So Avner was very upset by what Ishbosheth said, and he replied, "Am I a dog's head from Judah? Here I have been loyally serving the house of your father Saul and his kin and friends, and I have not betrayed you into the hands of David," right? We're losing this war. I'm the one who set you up here. We're as linked as possible. If you go down, I go down. And this is what you want to talk about? We're losing the war. Yet this day over this woman you reproach me. Right. Why would you treat me like I'm some Judahite general who's against you? Right? I had the power to give you to David for my own skin, to save my skin, and I haven't done it.
Aren't we replaying too the story of, was it Reuben, who slept with
Judah. With the
Jacob?
oh yeah. I mean, look, there's a lot of uncovering the nakedness of your father, and I think there's some of that here. That like obviously, like that seems to be a natural reaction from the kid, right? If you're Saul's kid, there's some natural reaction there, like, oh, this person was close to my father. You seem to be moving into that place. I think there's some legitimate concern, but it's a bad political move. It's the kind of bad political move David would never make, right? David would never be like, the guy who's running my whole thing, who I need very desperately at this moment, why don't I just rake him over the coals for something? He'd never be so stupid. Ishbosheth, he's a shameful, stupid guy. So again, he doesn't even get a name. No name for this guy.
Can you
Yeah.
say a sentence about the nakedness of the father?
Oh, the idea of someone sleeping with someone who his father had slept with. In this case, he's not sleeping with his father's concubine, but somebody else's. In the story of Noah, you had his son uncover his nakedness by going in and, well, we're not exactly sure what happened in that situation, but whatever it was not so good. There's a couple situations like that where someone might be drunk or whatever, naked, and there's a level of respecting your parents, especially in this case, respecting your father, that you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to expose or embarrass them. You're not supposed to shame them by, God forbid, sleeping with your mother-in-law. Like you're not supposed to do any of these things. And it could be that he's protecting the honor of his father in this situation. It could be.
I'm asking if sleeping with your uh, mother-in-law or
Well, he's not. Yeah,
your
it's in this.
stepmother would reveal the nakedness of the father.
Yeah, so it's not like literally revealing the nakedness of. It's just like exposing and treating badly, disrespecting. Exposing the nakedness of your father kind of is a euphemism for disrespect. Sometimes in the first sense, when it happens, it's literal. It's literally what happens. But afterwards, it's used as a euphemism for a metaphor for disrespect.
And I may be very naive and idealistic here, but the message seems to be to kingdom and politics is much more important than relationship and love and who you connect.
That's what it is to be a king. And the sad thing is, this is what God warned them about. Said, you don't want a king. You don't want it because a king's got to be involved in all these terrible, corrupt, earthly matters.
Heavy as the crown.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like the opposite of it's good to be the king, though, right? That's like that's like when a king is obsessed with duty and caring for his people. That's when I would say heavy lies the crown, right? Because it's like, okay, like that's the weight of taking care of his people is impacting this king. This is not, that was never Saul's problem. Saul had problems, but his problems were probably syphilis. We're not exactly sure. His problems were caused by God, as far as the Torah is concerned. God drove him mad.
Idealistic, but yeah. It's a burden to be the king.
It can be a burden if you're doing it well.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Syphilis can also drive you mad.
Yes, that's why we think it might have been syphilis in scientific terms. Although God could have given him, I'm not taking the divine punishment out of it. It could still be God that gave him syphilis. And they wouldn't have known what syphilis was, so it would have seemed like a curse from God at the time. Like, how would they have, I mean, maybe he would have known. I don't really know much about syphilis, so I'm not an expert. I just know it drives you a little nutso, or a lot nutso. I don't really know that much about it. Ask a doctor if you want to know more about syphilis.
Last week,
Came from God.
There you go. Great. Right. Right.
Interesting that Othner is like associated with kinship and relationships like several times. Like he's the one who's like invoking it to call off the fight, and like whether or not he was doing that disingenuously or not, it's still like a theme that is like surrounding him, and I find that interesting.
Absolutely, and they're both kind of disingenuous, right? Because then the other Yoav says back, "Oh well, we were going to stop anyway," but it's really because they're too far away and it's not worth it. They don't want to get too stretched. They don't have supply lines, so they're gonna anyway. Yeah. But yes, it's a very, but that's a very Jewish way of dealing with these things, like to appeal to relationship, to try and solve problems, because relationships are extremely important, especially familial and bonds, relationships and bonds of loyalty are extremely important. We saw that here with David and Jonathan. Their bonds of loyalty were far more important to them than the bonds of blood that, for instance, Jonathan shared with Saul. Although those are important too. Jonathan still died by his father's side fighting. He didn't run to be with David because he really loved him more. The bonds of blood matter too, but there are more than one kind of bond. In Judaism, there are lots of bonds that tie us together, and it's not like blood is always the strongest one. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's duty. There are lots of different things that bind up Jews. It's funny because I only laugh because what we say when a Jew dies. In El Malei Rachamim, in the funeral prayer, what do we say? Vayitzror bitzror. May you be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. B'chayim olam. May you be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. So may you be bonded so tightly that you that you're with God. Yeah.
I heard a Jewish story where the difference between heaven and hell is, well, in both places, everyone is at a table and they're all chained together. But in hell, they all reach for the food at the same time, and so they can't achieve it.
Yeah, it's this one. I don't know if it's a Jewish story. It's the one where they all have to go like this, and it's the same in both. But in heaven, they feed each other, so everyone's eating. And in hell, they don't, because they're bad people. So they just sit there and be upset all the time.
When you're talking about bounds or being bound up, that's what I thought of as these chains in the afterlife.
Yeah. Well, we hope that's not, what the afterlife is like. Right. But yeah, I mean, even bound people can still do good.
What I thought of is, well, Jews are so bound, maybe that's why so many Jews go into psychiatry.
Jews are so bound, we literally bind ourselves. When you put on tefillin, you are saying, V'estichli, bind me to your way, God. And you wrap yourself in a leather strap till you can see the impressions on your arm. That's a powerful daily, for people who do tefillin daily. It's a powerful daily reminder in the morning that you are bound to what God wants from you. And Jews are okay. We're okay with taking that on and being bound, and we're generally okay with that.
It extends a little. You're bound to God and you're bound to what your mother wants of you to.
Well, yeah. I said we're bound in so many ways. That's why the guilt, as I said, it's like that was also, there was guilt even in those generals were using guilt. They were like, oh, you're gonna. Okay. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So Abner is upset. So he continues, he says, may God do thus and more to Avner, if I do not do for David as God swore to him. To transfer the kingship from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Dan up in the Golan to Beersheba down in the desert. Ishbosheth could say nothing more in reply to Abner because he was afraid of him. Abner immediately began to act in accordance with that oath he just declared. He sent messengers to David saying, to whom shall the land belong? And to say further, make a pact with me and I will help you and bring all Israel over to your side. Once again, really dumb move by Ishbosheth. And what does he do to try and appease the guy after he makes his oath? Nothing. He sits there and he's afraid and he goes, oh no, what's he going to do? I'm just going to sit here. Okay, that's one way to act, I guess. Not a very kingly way to act, I would say. But hey, he won't be king for much longer.
Also, that high-pitched voice is unkingly.
Well, I'm no king, so it's just what I give to characters called Ishbosheth. I assume if he's a shameful guy, that might be what he sounds like. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry about the voice acting and all that,
No need to
yeah. Anyway, he replied, okay, so now we get the reply, right? David got this letter and he's like, whoa, the head of the guy who set up this Saulite is gonna turn the whole army and country over to me. God must be good. It must be God's will. So he replied, good, I will make a pact with you, but I make one demand upon you. I don't have enough wives. I want my other one back. Do not appear before me unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come before me. Right? He hasn't forgotten. He doesn't have 6 wives. How many does he have? 7, because Michal is still his wife, has been since she was his first wife. And he says, well, part of the point of marrying Michal in the first place was it was a claim over the kingdom. So I need Michal back. I'm not going to treat her nicely. I'm sorry. I wish he did. I'm not going to treat her nicely, but I do need her politically. So if you're going to really be with me, you need to give me my wife back. My political wife, my most political wife. So David also sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, to say, give me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins. If you remember back then, that was it was his own like Herculean trial. It was like if Saul was like, oh, I don't really want this guy to marry him, so I'll make him kill 100 Philistines and deliver their foreskins to me. And if he does that, then he can marry her. And of course, David did, because he was the best warrior ever. And so he was like, oh, what do I do? Now I got to give my wife to my daughter to this guy to be his wife. Anyway, if you remember that story, that's what happened.
You would just like toss it in a fire, because it's gonna smell horrible.
Because it's skin, yeah. If you wanted me to make an irreverent joke, I probably could. I don't know what he did with them. I don't think that was a super important thing. We definitely didn't throw him in a fire, because we do not do any form of human sacrifice. So we don't consume and smoke human flesh. We don't light people on fire. Not intentional. I mean, God forbid, if you shot a fire arrow or something at somebody and they lit it, but we don't light people on fire to torture them. We don't light people on fire to kill them. We don't light people. We don't do any of that. None of that.
No, we didn't start the fire.
Yeah.
We don't light people on fire is our song. We don't nobody gets consumed by fire. Human sacrifice is not one of the top innovation. The end of human sacrifice is one of the top innovations of the Jewish people. We don't do it. Other people in this region at the time did do it. We don't, and you'll learn more about that when we get to Jerusalem in a couple chapters, but we don't do that. So they probably didn't do that, but they either buried them or threw them away or fed them to animals. They might have done that.
Possible that it wasn't necessarily like 100% physical truth. It was just like the ideal of taking out.
I think I remember from the story, at least, if you're going to read this, I think he delivered him a bag of 100 Philistines. I mean, I don't think it was a metaphorical thing. I think he. Well, the idea was he would die in the attempt.
And in the foreshadowing later of David and Uriah the Hittite.
Yeah, that too. Well, we'll get to Uriah. Yeah, that's another interesting move of David's. Yeah.
How valuable are 100 foreskins accounting for inflation?
They're not valuable at all. Their purpose wasn't for value. Their purpose was to get David killed. And since it didn't work, it backfired on Saul, because again, Saul was a dummy and nothing he did worked. But that was kind of the idea of Saul, right? He was the prototypical king. What?
How did the wife get separated? I didn't understand that part.
David fled without her. Remember when David fled from Saul the first time, he left. Michal helped him escape, and Michal stayed behind. And so she lived with Saul and stayed with Saul and his family from that point on.
Why did she stay behind?
It was part of the escape attempt. It was needed for her to stay behind so David could escape. So it wasn't like he left her, but he wasn't intentionally trying to leave her behind. But he was like, and anyway, so
after that, it's like she's behind enemy lines, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
She's a captive, essentially. She's a guest, right? Anyone who's seen Game of Thrones or something, or a medieval show knows where it's like, oh yes, you're a guest of the king, but you can't leave your room and you can't leave this, and it's like, so she was a guest of her father from that and from that point on, and now I guess her brother. So he's like, hey, I paid the bride price. That's a big thing in our culture. I paid, she's my wife, I want her back. So Ishbosheth sent her and had her taken away from her husband. Remember, she was given to a new husband at some Paltiel, son of Laish. And her husband walked with her as far as Bahurim, weeping as he followed her. Then Avner ordered him to turn back, and he went back. Avner had conferred with the elders of Israel, saying, you have wanted David to be king over you all along. Is that true? That's an interesting statement, right? Avner, the head of Saul's army, theoretically, goes to the elders, the leaders of the tribes, and says, you really wanted David the whole time. You didn't really want Saul's kid. It's an interesting thing. So he says, now act. The ata asu, and now it is your time to do something. For God has said concerning David, I will deliver my people Israel from the hands of the Philistines and all its other enemies through my servant David. So what's the appeal? Winning. For years, 7 years now, they've been occupied by the Philistines. Large tracts of the land that they were supposed to have conquered and lived in are being ruled by the Philistines. David promises victory, is what Avner says. David will unite us and we'll win, as opposed to continuing to be fractured. It's a political message. He doesn't say, he doesn't say, Samuel the prophet said that God said that David should be king instead of Saul. That is not part of the argument. Nobody is making the theological argument for David. Everyone is making the practical argument for David. He's a great warrior in general. He wins battles. He'll win. Yeah, sorry.
It's probably a minor detail and it might not be known. Was the first wife's new husband, was she gifted to him as spoils?
No.
Okay.
No, it was just he found her a husband so that she couldn't go back to, so that David couldn't really be like, he had the marriage annulled by the priests, I guess, he's the king, and he married her to somebody else so that David wouldn't be able to claim the kingship based on his marriage to Saul's daughter, which was his big fear from the beginning when he married Michal, that David would supplant Jonathan by saying, well, I'm married to the king's daughter and I'm this big hero, so make me the king. It's funny, we will get a general later who totally just takes over a kingdom. My boy Omri. Anyway, yeah.
You've set up a very interesting contrast here. On the one hand,
I hope so.
we're to believe that David is good.
Oh,
because
yeah.
He has faith in God.
He does.
It's a theological message, but you just said the whole argument behind his kingship now is political.
Avner's is.
There's no
Avner's is.
Avner's.
This is Avner's message to the leaders of Israel, not David's.
Yeah.
There's a message to take from this, and I would say it's that realpolitik has its place, even in theological debates. You're right. This should be theological. God said who should be king, and that's who should be king. But we don't always live in a purely theological world. These people are occupied by the Philistines. They need help. They need to be relieved of this burden. They need someone who can win. Now, it happens to be that this is all going to come together. But I don't think that... I love this line here in 18 when he's speaking to the leaders, and he says, "Ve'ata asu, act now." What is it that we say? I just read it last night at services. Pray as if everything depended on God, and act as if everything depended on you. It's a very Jewish concept. The theological case for David is obvious and strong. Is it the most convincing at this moment? Which is more important? Which would David say is more important? Being convincing and winning so that you can glorify God? Or making a point and losing?
Yeah, I was thinking earlier that we were talking about how much of David is driven by faith, and that even though but other people interpret, other people around him interpret it as cynicism.
Yeah.
I think that clearly faith is his motivation, but he uses other things as tools because he knows that faith alone isn't going to convince everyone around him, even though that's the core of his motivation to do things. So I think that's relevant here too.
Absolutely. And as I said, David is insanely good politically. He makes he'll eventually make some bad ones, But he makes up to this point, he's made purely great strategic and practical decisions. Strategic decisions. So, he's a good politician as well as someone who believes in God. The problem becomes David believes, and this is a problem that we see in people today too sometimes. When you believe you're doing what God wants, and when everything goes well for you and you believe it's because God has made that so, does every thought of yours become a wish of God's? Does everything you want inherently become God's will?
If you're Muhammad.
That becomes David's trap. David wins and wins and wins because God wants him to win. And he keeps winning after he becomes fully king. And then it becomes, well, does everything that originates in my mind, is it put there by God? Is every decision I make ordained by God? And that's a dangerous place to get to, because then you can't be political.
And I think that's what I'm struggling with. Not so much.
He's not there yet. He's not there yet.
Favorite, but with more. As I live my life, should I be saying to myself, well, I'll do what's strategically important and will get me what I want because God will be happy? Or should I be making my decision on the basis of, Lauren, you think you know what God wants you to do the right thing.
Should play the lottery.
I just as for everyone on the internet, don't do that. Don't play the lottery. It's a bad idea. But it's an interesting question. I don't think we should ever think we know the mind of God. I think that's a very dangerous place to get to. I think that's how most of the bad things with religion in the world come about, is when people think they know better than God does. Or that their interpretation can't be what I like,
Corrected.
or even adjusted. What we want in Judaism is for when you have an idea like that, you say, I had a thought and I thought about it and there was something about what I wanted and I think God wants it too. And here's my source from the Torah. You're supposed to get with your chavruta. If you're supposed to have a chavruta, someone to study Torah with, you could come to this group and you could say, hey, this is my idea. And we'd all say, hey, Lauren, that's really dumb. Don't do that. See, you have someone to bounce in interpreting the Torah. You have someone to bounce ideas off of. You don't just make an idea and go, haha, that's what it is now. That's not how interpreting Torah works. So I'd say anytime you have an idea, that's wonderful. Bring it to friends, bring it to people who study Torah and say, what do you think? Do you think the Torah is in line with this? And we can talk about it, because that's how you're supposed to work your way through that, is and people will go to you and they'll be like, you go, I really think what God wants is for me to buy a new convertible. I think, and in the Torah, it says you should leave the stars sight above you. And so how can I do that if I don't have a convertible to see the stars above me? And I'd say, Lauren, that's a really stupid quote from the Torah to use for that thing. Don't do that. Or maybe, if you have the money, then great, do it. It's wonderful. But like, if you don't, then like God didn't ask you to buy that. Right. And you'd be like, now that I think about it, Rabbi, I think maybe I just really wanted that convertible and I didn't, I wanted a reason, or I wanted something to, whatever, you know what I mean? Like yeah.
If there was a time in history where it was worth making the distinction between who should be leader based on political convenience versus who should be leader based on the theological case for it, does that imply that presently we're at a moment in history where our leadership is split between those who are politically convenient versus those who have a theological case for holding leadership?
Like in this country?
Or Israel?
Okay, so I mean, it's a different answer in every place. I would say I don't think, again, in America, we're not supposed to have, if a rabbi came to me and said, I'm going to run for president because I want basic values of the Torah represented, egalitarianism, fairness, I'd say, don't run for president, idiot. That's what I'd say to that rabbi, because I don't want a rabbi to run for president. I don't want religious leaders determining, this is America, and it's not a place for that. We don't go based off any one particular religion's view of what God wants for us. That's just not how America has ever functioned, and I don't think it could succeed that way. In Israel, there are some who believe that the governance of the state is divinely inspired. They are very dangerous, because anyone who believes that what they want is ordained by God, it's very difficult to negotiate with. And Israel never functioned that way until the last decade and a half. It was always an extremely secular state for a Jewish state.
I was thinking that there would be religious Jews in Israel who had a preferred leadership based on a theological case, even if that leadership never gained.
They do
power.
kind of. The closest thing to that I can think is that the Haredi Jews in Israel
Mhm.
would much prefer that Israel didn't exist. Because, well, not much prefer, they'd slightly prefer it. Because they do get a lot of benefits from living there. But the Torah says that the seed of David, the Messiah, will come and bring the Jews back to sovereignty in the land of Israel. When that happens, that's when the Messiah comes. And so since the Messiah didn't come, they believe the Jews shouldn't be sovereign in the land of Israel until that point. So Jewish sovereignty in the land now is an affront to God, according to a very niche, small percentage of the Jewish
How will
people.
we define when the Messiah comes?
Very easy. There's a set of there's a list in the Talmud of what the Messiah will do. One of which is bring the Jews back to sovereignty in the land of Israel. But the Messiah can't come, and I know there are Christians here. The Messiah can't come until Isaiah 53 is fulfilled. Is one of the conditions also.
Remind me.
The suffering servant. Except, of course, we are the suffering servant, the Jewish people. The individual framing in that chapter comes from Yisrael as a solo, being a stand-in for the people of Israel. And until the world acknowledges that the Jews have suffered for the sins of the world and makes restitution to us, the world can't be redeemed. So the non-Jews can get on that. That's not my business. But if you, I always say, and I don't know, with Christians, I think we could get along because y'all are waiting for a second coming and we're waiting for a first. So maybe we could all we'll see what happens when all that happens. It could all happen at once. I don't know. It's not my business, but we don't really think about the end that much. It should be noted. Jews don't really, it's not like, that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to make this place better. Right. We're not big on apocalypse.
Does Isaiah 53 use the word pierced, or am I thinking of a different verse?
It might. I gotta look it up. Pierced.
Pierced.
But again, it's in Hebrew, so I gotta look it up.
Mm.
But anyway, let me just see how many more. Shoot, we got a bunch. Okay. We're gonna pause here because we're at 10:30. Can somebody write down what verse we're at so we can? It's going to be great. David is going to take over and things are going to be awesome. Everyone on YouTube, thank you so